History is often written not just in ink, but in blood, in fire, and in silence. Some stories fade into myth, others are buried beneath the dust of forgotten chronicles. But few tales shine with the strange brilliance of both holiness and heresy as that of the Knights Templar. Imagine a world at the dawn of the 12th century. Jerusalem, city of God, city of war, has just been seized by the Christian armies of the First Crusade. In July 1099, the Crusaders poured into the Holy City, drenched in the fervor of faith and the madness of conquest. They had sworn to reclaim it for Christendom, and they succeeded, though at a cost steeped in violence. The West rejoiced. Pilgrims began to pour into the Holy Land, carrying with them relics, prayers, and a longing for redemption. But the road was dangerous. Bandits and hostile forces lurked across the rugged terrain between the coast and the holy sites. What good was Jerusalem, Christians asked, if the faithful could not safely walk its paths? It was in this crucible of faith and fear that a new brotherhood emerged. Not priests, not monks, not soldiers, yet somehow, all of these things at once. Around the year 1119, 9 knights gathered under the banner of a humble mission to protect pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land. At their head was Hugues de Payens, a knight of Champagne. His companions were few, their resources meager, yet their vow was absolute. They took oaths of poverty, chastity, and obedience, mirroring the monastic life. But unlike monks cloistered behind stone walls, these men carried swords, rode war horses, and pledged themselves to fight, to kill, and if need be, to die. The King of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, saw in them both utility and devotion. He granted them a place to live, none other than a wing of the royal palace built on the ruins of Solomon's temple. And it was from this sacred location that their name would forever echo through history, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. At first, they were little more than an oddity, monks in mail, ascetics with blades. The church had not yet sanctioned them. Many regarded them with suspicion. What business had men of God, they wondered, in the spilling of blood? But the Templars' destiny changed in 1129, when the Council of Troyes officially recognized them as an order of the church. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most powerful churchmen of his age, lent them his pen and his blessing. In his treatise in praise of the new knighthood, Bernard defended the paradox of their existence. These were not men who killed for greed or vengeance, he argued. They were instruments of divine justice, wielding the sword of God himself. With papal approval came power. The knights were granted privileges that placed them outside the reach of kings and bishops. They answered only to the Pope. They could travel freely across Christendom, collect donations, and establish houses in every land. Thus began the transformation of a handful of poor knights into the most formidable military and financial institution of the Middle Ages. Part 2. From poverty to power, the Templars grew swiftly. Their white mantles, marked with a red cross, became symbols of both fear and reverence. In battle, they were disciplined, almost fanatical. Bound by strict rules, they were forbidden to retreat unless outnumbered 3 to 1. To break formation was a sin, to abandon a comrade a disgrace. Chronicles describe their charges as thunderbolts of steel, horse and rider united in ferocity, banners snapping like fire in the wind. But war was not their only domain. Donations from pious kings, nobles, and common folk poured into the order. Land, castles, and money flowed steadily into Templar hands. They were granted estates in France, England, Spain, Portugal, and across Europe. With wealth came responsibility and innovation. The Templars became pioneers of a new kind of enterprise, a financial network that stretched across Christendom. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem could deposit money at a Templar house in Europe, then withdraw it safely in the Holy Land. In essence, the Templars created the world's first international banking system. Their coffers grew vast. Their fleets sailed the Mediterranean. Their castles dotted the frontier of the Holy Land, formidable bulwarks of stone. In time, kings themselves borrowed money from them. Princes entrusted them with treasures. Yet for all their riches, the Templars themselves lived under rules of stark simplicity. They ate at common tables, wore coarse clothing, and shunned the comforts of private life. At least in theory. Whether every knight followed the rule is another matter, but the legend of their poverty endured. This dual image, poor monks, yet lords of wealth, added to their mystique. Who were these men who combined prayer with violence, poverty with riches, secrecy with power? The answer, perhaps, is that they were something entirely new, the first truly international organization of the medieval world. And like all such creations, Their brilliance would invite both awe and envy. Part 3. Mystique, Myths, and Secrets. The Templars were not merely soldiers or bankers. They became symbols, wrapped in a cloak of mystery, whispered about in both reverence and fear. From their earliest days, their proximity to sacred sites in Jerusalem stirred imaginations. Living in the former Temple of Solomon, they seemed guardians not only of pilgrims but of ancient secrets. What relics, people wondered, might they have unearthed beneath those stones? Some said the Ark of the Covenant, the chest that held the tablets of Moses. Others whispered of the Holy Grail, the chalice of Christ himself. There is no solid evidence that the Templars possessed these treasures. Yet the silence of the order, their closed rituals, and their refusal to explain themselves only fueled the rumors. And in a medieval world where mystery was fertile soil, myths grew like wildfire. Even their daily life seemed paradoxical. They prayed like monks, yet marched to war. They took vows of poverty, yet handled the wealth of nations. Their rule, a strict code of conduct, forbade them from hunting, swearing, or even kissing their mothers or sisters. They were not to adorn themselves with gold or silk. And yet, across Europe, they became landlords of vast estates, lords of castles, and patrons of kings. The contradiction made them appear otherworldly. To common people, they were a brotherhood apart, touched by divine purpose, or perhaps by darker powers. As the Crusades raged on, the Templars stood at the very heart of Christendom's struggle in the Holy Land. They fought at key battles, Montgazard, Hattin, La Fabaye. They garrisoned castles like Safed, Tortosa, and the impregnable fortress of Crac des Chevaliers. To see the white mantles with red crosses arrayed on a battlefield was to know that God's army had arrived. But no legend lasts forever unbroken. And the Holy Land, that fragile prize for which so much blood had been spilled, began to slip from Christian hands. Part 4. Enemies, Defeats, and Decline. By the late 12th century, a new star had risen in the east, Salah ad-Din, known in the west as Saladin. His armies were disciplined, his strategy brilliant, and his cause, reclaiming Jerusalem for Islam, was embraced with fervor. In 1187, the Crusaders faced him at the Battle of Hattin. The Templars fought bravely, but it was a catastrophe. Surrounded, outmaneuvered, and cut off from water, the Crusader army was annihilated. Many knights, including Templars, were captured. Saladin, though merciful to some prisoners, ordered the execution of the Templars and Hospitallers, who were considered too dangerous to be ransomed. One chronicler wrote that their bodies covered the field like stones of a ruined wall. Jerusalem fell soon after. Though later Crusades would recapture fragments of territory, the dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was dying. The Templars continued their mission, but their role shifted. With each lost stronghold, they were pushed closer to the sea. Acre, their last great bastion, fell in 1291 after a brutal siege. The surviving knights fled, carrying with them only fragments of their once proud legacy. Now homeless in the east, the Templars retreated to Cyprus and Europe. But there, they faced a new challenge: envy. For 2 centuries, the order had grown into a state within states. They owned land across France, England, Spain, and beyond. They were exempt from taxes, answered only to the Pope, and held the purse strings of kings. They had become, in short, too powerful. And power breeds enemies. Kings indebted to the Templars began to resent their creditors. Clergy accused them of pride and corruption. Ordinary people, baffled by their secrecy, whispered of heresy. It was in France, under King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, that the storm would finally break. Philip was ambitious, cunning, and deeply in debt to the Templars. For years he had borrowed from them to fund his wars. Now, unable or unwilling to repay, he set his eyes on their destruction. But to crush the most sacred order of Christendom, he needed more than greed. He needed charges that would shock the world. Part 5. The trial begins. It was the dawn of Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date that would echo with dread for centuries to come. Across France, as the sun rose, the king's men moved swiftly. Doors were broken down, knights were dragged from the beds, commanderies were seized. The order that had once defended Christendom was suddenly branded as its enemy. King Philip IV had orchestrated the downfall with meticulous care. For months he had plotted in secrecy, preparing arrest warrants sealed with his royal authority. On that fateful morning, nearly every Templar in France was taken. Their charges were shocking: heresy, blasphemy, sodomy, idolatry. The Templars, it was claimed, denied Christ, spat upon the cross, worshipped a mysterious idol called Baphomet, and practiced obscene rituals in the shadows of their chapels. To the medieval mind, these accusations were not merely scandalous, they were apocalyptic. If true, they meant that the holiest warriors of Christendom had in fact been servants of the devil. But were they true? Modern historians almost unanimously say no. The charges were fabrications, designed to justify Philip's seizure of the Templars' wealth and erase his debts. The idol, the obscene rituals, the denials of Christ, these were inventions crafted under torture. For indeed, torture was the king's chosen weapon. Prisoners were stretched on the rack, burned with fire, pressed under crushing weights. Broken in body and spirit, many knights confessed to crimes they had never committed. The Pope at the time, Clement V, was caught in a trap. As the Bishop of Rome, he should have defended the Templars, for they were a papal order, answerable only to him. But Clement was weak, fearful, and politically bound to Philip. At first, he protested. But as the confessions poured in, however tainted by torture, they became impossible to ignore. The Pope authorized further inquiries, and the trial of the Templars expanded beyond France. Across Europe, brothers of the order were arrested, interrogated, and in some cases executed. Part 6. The Fall of the Grand Master. The heart of the drama lay with one man, Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and final Grand Master of the Templars. A veteran of the Crusades, Molay was by then in his 70s, a man of dignity and faith. When first arrested, he confessed under torture, like so many of his brethren. But later, when brought before the papal court, he retracted his words. He swore that the order was innocent, that its vows were holy, and that its mission had always been in service of Christ. This defiance enraged Philip. The king could not allow the Templars' honor to be restored. He pressed Clement to take harsher action, and in 1312, the Pope formally suppressed the order at the Council of Vienne. Officially, the Templars were not condemned as heretics, but dissolved for the sake of peace in Christendom. Their lands and wealth were, in theory, transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, another military order. In practice, much of it fell into royal coffers. Philip had won, but the Templars' final chapter had yet to be written. In March 1314, Jacques de Molay and several other leaders were brought to Paris. They were to give a final confession before sentencing. Instead, Molay shocked the crowd by again proclaiming the order's innocence. He denied the charges, declared the confessions false, and called upon God to judge between the Templars and their persecutors. Philip, furious, ordered him burned alive that very evening. On an island in the Seine, before a crowd of onlookers, the last Grand Master was chained to a stake. As the flames rose, witnesses claimed he did not cry out, but held his head high, praying until the smoke consumed him. Legend says that with his final breath, Molay summoned Philip IV and Clement V to meet him before God within the year. Remarkably, both men died within months. To many, this seemed divine justice, the vengeance of the Templars' martyred leader. Part 7. Aftermath and Echoes. With the death of Jacques de Molay, the Order of the Temple was no more. Its properties were seized, its knights scattered. Some joined the Hospitallers. Others retired quietly, blending into monastic life or secular society. Yet the story of the Templars did not end with their suppression. If anything, it began anew. In the centuries that followed, myths multiplied. Some claimed that bands of fugitive Templars had fled to Scotland, fighting at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 under Robert the Bruce. Others whispered that they had sailed west across the Atlantic, carrying their treasures to lands unknown, perhaps even to America. Their supposed secrets became the seedbed of countless legends, that they guarded the Holy Grail, that they preserved the bloodline of Christ, that they possessed forbidden knowledge handed down from ancient times. Masons, mystics, and secret societies would later claim descent from the Templars, weaving them into webs of hidden history. Even today, their name echoes in novels, films, and conspiracy theories, a symbol of lost power and mysterious truth. But behind the myths lies a reality both simpler and more profound. The Templars were men of their age, pious, flawed, courageous, and sometimes cruel. They built one of the most powerful institutions of the medieval world, only to see it destroyed by envy, greed, and politics. Their fall was not just the end of a brotherhood. It was a warning that even the mightiest orders, clothed in divine authority, can be undone by human ambition. Part 8. Closing reflection. So what remains of the Knights Templar? Not their castles, which lie in ruins. Not their armies, long turned to dust. Not even their treasure, which, if it ever existed, is lost to time. What remains is a legacy of devotion and discipline, of myth and mystery, a tale that continues to fascinate because it lies at the intersection of faith and power, truth and legend. Perhaps that is why the Templars still haunt our imagination. They were warriors who prayed, monks who fought, bankers who vowed poverty. They were contradictions embodied, and contradictions make the best stories. On that cold March night in Paris, as Jacques de Molay faced the fire, he could not have known that his death would give birth to centuries of legend. But in the end, the Templars achieved a strange kind of immortality, not as conquerors of Jerusalem, not as lords of treasure, but as symbols of mystery, forever caught between history and myth. And so the story of the Knights Templar ends, not with a victory, but with a flame. And yet, in the silence after the fire, their red cross still burns in our imagination, as bright and enigmatic as ever.